Starting way back in 1986, the Castlevania games have had their ups and downs over the years, and after the somewhat lackluster release of Harmony of Dissonance on the GBA, Aria of Sorrow was a real return to form, and proved that there was still life in the series yet. Now the story places you into the shoes of Soma Cruz. He soon finds himself entangled within Dracula's castle, with the only hope of escaping being to take on the grotesque monsters that roam its inner walls. When it comes to gameplay, anyone familiar with the series will instantly feel right at home. The game is largely split up into 8 separate areas, with the player being able to find and use a wide range of weaponry to their advantage. But it's not just all about simply slashing away at your enemies though, as there's some rather interesting mechanics in play, such as the soul system. There are 3 types of souls to collect from fallen enemies. You've got red, blue and yellow, which all grant the player various abilities, such as reducing your falling speed, giving you the ability to fly, or short stat boosts that help even the playing field. Now visually, Aria of Sorrow is in a league of its own, with Soma animating much more fluidly than other Castlevania protagonists, and controlling him feels extremely smooth and responsive. Enemies, and the bosses in particular, are also meticulously animated and detailed, but the real winner is the environments, which are just extremely atmospheric. From the get-go, it is very clear that a lot of effort went into the graphical design of this game. If you're a fan of the series, Aria of Sorrow is well worth checking out for yourself. If you've been following my channel for some time, you'll already know that I'm a huge fan of Kingdom Hearts. Starting out on the PlayStation 2, it would go on to spawn several sequels that spanned many different consoles, and at first you'd think bringing such a visceral experience to Nintendo's handheld wouldn't translate that well, mainly due to the lack of power of the console, but Square worked their magic and took advantage of the system the best way they could. When it comes to gameplay, Chain of Memories is rather unique, and deploys a card-based system when it comes to battle. From your attacks, magic and summons, everything you do in the game revolves around these cards. Each of them has a certain value on it, which has nothing to do with its strength, but it actually adds a bit of strategy to the battle system. Whenever you or the enemy perform a move in battle, the card that is used is put in the middle of the screen. If the enemy's card has a higher value than yours, then his attack will go through and vice versa. I'll admit it does take a while to get used to, but it easily becomes one of the most enjoyable aspects of the game. What helps Chain of Memories stand out even further is just how well the game is presented. For a start, the FMV sequences fans will know and love also make an appearance here on the GBA. Sure, they're obviously not as detailed as their PS2 counterparts, but they still look great considering the power of the console. Matching them are the in-game visuals themselves, which are made up by some of the smoothest animations you'll ever see on the GBA. Not to mention an abundance of sprites on screen at once, especially during some of the more challenging fights you'll encounter throughout the adventure. Unfortunately, during these moments, the game is prone to a bit of frame drop, but it's nothing that impacts the gameplay in a truly negative fashion. Overall, Chain of Memories is a solid entry in the series that's well worth adding to your collection if you're a fan of the franchise. The Game Boy Advance played host to a range of incredible shooters, with the likes of R-Type and Gradius to name a couple. Fans of the genre were never at a loss when it came to playing something good, but one that never got a fair look at was Oridian 2, which was perhaps one of the most ambitious projects on the GBA. Now after its somewhat lackluster debut with its first release in the series, Shinen hoped to right its wrongs with a sequel, but unfortunately thanks to the foul taste that had been left by the first game, Oridian 2 would go by largely unnoticed. When it comes to gameplay, pretty much like any shooter, you get a selection of ships to use across a series of stages that naturally increase in difficulty the more you progress. But a new feature to this sequel was the expansion of the weaponry that the player gets to use. The weapons available are as varied as they are interesting, ranging from standard laser shots to more devastating bursts and lock-on options that make taking on the hordes of enemies that come your way all the more enjoyable. Now although whilst playing, the angle of the view field may feel a bit odd, but trust me, after a bit of practice there's nothing to it. There aren't many games that use this angled perspective, but it's definitely a valid approach, and it allows you to see further up the stage. Tilting the playing field also opens the door for some very nice looking visuals. The level artwork is gorgeous, and the scrolling view makes you wonder how the hell they are doing this on the GBA. The engine limits the levels to repeating pattern corridors, but there are plenty of dynamic obstacles integrated, and the artwork varies nicely from level level to level. Oridian 2 is an example of a complete fix of a screwed up game. Shinen pretty much looked at their first attempt and saw what not to do and did exactly that. The result? One of the most enjoyable vertical shooters on the GBA, which just so happens to be one of the most graphically impressive as well. The Mario RPG series began way back in 1996 on the Super Nintendo, when Squaresoft and Nintendo co-produced a classic, Legend of the Seven Stars, with Nintendo themselves bringing the sequel, Paper Mario, to the N64. Now, Superstar Saga was strongly influenced by both, and takes many aspects from each game to mix it into something new. Sure, it's turn-based and I know what you're thinking. Whilst this is the basic fighting structure, there is so much more to it. To start off, you can only use jump attacks. If you choose to jump on an enemy, you will do standard damage to it. However, if you hit the A button with Mario or the B button with Luigi, you'll do a little bit of extra damage. But the attacks don't end there. Later on, you learn about brother attacks, where Mario and Luigi work together to deal a powerful blow. Now, some people like myself weren't too sold on the Game Boy Advance's graphics capabilities. Though it is a more powerful system than the Super Nintendo, a lot of its games look drab and grainy. Superstar Saga changed that. It is perhaps one of the finest looking Game Boy Advance games ever made. The visuals are crisp and vibrant. The game takes place in a slightly isometric point of view rather than a pure overhead, and it works pretty well without succumbing to the disorientation that usually follows. Also, with worthy mention is the sprite animations, which are elaborate and very detailed. Occasionally there's a moment where you can see the pixelated outline of a close-up character, but for the most part, Superstar Saga is a very smooth game. It would make for a great addition for anyone's constantly growing collection, as it's a lot of fun, and although somewhat easy and short, the game is an absolute blast to make your way through. The Game Boy Advance's RPG lineup was one of the console's strongest aspects, and even though when it comes to gameplay, Sword of Mana is by no means the best example, it is hands down still one of the best looking games on the system. At the beginning of the adventure, you get to choose your nameless hero, and depending on which gender you choose, your adventure will differ wildly, with different characters joining you and different dungeons and story sequences to be found. Sword of Mana's visuals are stunningly beautiful, and practically the epitome of 2D aesthetics and what the Game Boy Advance was intended for. Character sprites, for example, are large and well recognizable, featuring some extremely lovable details that make them stand out. The same goes for all of the locations found in the game, featuring great aesthetics, as well as vibrant and lush colors that make the game seem like a playable fairy tale, exploiting the vast color palette of the Game Boy Advance as much as possible, consisting of colorful and cute characters as well as towns. The bosses are sometimes impressively huge and wonderfully designed, making them a true highlight in each dungeon or castle. But even though I sound enthusiastic and completely positive about the visuals, they're sadly not without their flaws. There can be some nasty glitches like tearing, and to top it off, Slowdown rears its ugly head, especially when there are way too many enemies on screen. However, these flaws don't take away too much from the experience, as the visualization of the environments and characters as well as the art design are so well done. As I mentioned earlier, Sword of Mana is by no means one of the best RPGs on the system, but if you're looking for some eye candy, it is well worth a pickup. The Metroid games have long been some of the most celebrated in Nintendo's back catalogue, and the Game Boy Advance release of Fusion was no exception. As with all of the 2D Metroid games, Samus can run, shoot beams and missiles, but she also gains a few extra feats as well, such as being able to grab onto ledges that makes traversing the environments all the more fluid. Now, unlike previous installments, what largely differentiates Fusion from the rest of the series is that it's a much more linear adventure. This time around, Samus takes on a series of objectives dished out by the ship's computer. Now, graphically, Metroid Fusion is one of the most impressive titles you'll see on the GBA. The colours in particular really push the handheld to its limits. It's tough to create a good looking game on such an underpowered system, but the developers obviously made the best of the situation and instead focused on aspects of the game's visual style that the Game Boy Advance could deal with. The result, a profound, immersive and atmospheric world that makes you believe what you're playing. What really stands out are the environments. options, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that a spaceship would be kind of limiting when it comes to diversity, but Metroid Fusion offers up a generous amount of different biomes to explore. From rich jungles to lava-filled caverns, it makes it an absolute joy to make your way through the game, as you'll never know what you'll encounter next. But of course, the enemies and sprite work also come into play, which is some of the most impressive on the handheld. May it be Samus herself or one of the incredible boss counters that litter the experience, there's a serious amount of detail that's afforded to them all. If you're a fan of the series or are simply looking to get into a new action platformer, Metroid Fusion is one of the best options. The Asterix series began life way back in '95 on the Super Nintendo and introduced us to the unlikely duo who never really got their chance to shine. Although this wasn't their first game on the Gameboy Advance, it was the first to be presented as a 3D platformer, and sure, while you could pick holes in the visuals if this appeared on any of the more powerful consoles, on the Gameboy Advance it's something of a miracle. Using a modified engine that was previously seen in V-Rally 3 and Stuntman was a stroke of genius, and the results were very pleasing to say the least. The animation is good too, with both Asterix and Obelix moving around the various locations just as you'd expect them to. It's not all good though, and some areas do appear rushed. The cutscenes, for example, are taken directly from the console version. Perhaps a little bit more time spent to produce some comic book images would have been a better way to go. The 3D engine too occasionally groans under the strain of shifting perspectives, and you'll occasionally be able to see through walls or get trapped in non-existent holes, but this is a small price to pay for what's on offer here. Seeing this up and running on the handheld is just absolutely fascinating. The gameplay is a bit restrictive thanks to the rather unsuitable amount of buttons on the GBA, so I'm not going to stand here and pretend that this game is awesome to play, as it's really not. But the technical achievement of the team behind it is something that needs to be pointed out and celebrated. There's more than enough here to justify a purchase though, and whether you're an Asterix fan or not, this really should have a place in every serious GBA collection. There was no shortage of quality races on the Game Boy Advance, but the one that took the trophy had to be V-Rally 3. It's essentially a port of its home console counterpart that manages to retain many of the aspects that made its equivalent so good. Like most racing games, you'll find yourself spending most of your time in the championship mode, which is set out into several stages across one location, from the dusty mountains of the Portuguese outback to the damp and dreary English countryside. There's a generous amount of courses scattered throughout the competition, and the game does start off quite easy, but play a few more rallies and time trials and you'll come to realise that the game actually adopts your best times for use in the rally mode. Obviously this makes the game progressively harder and drives you to improve. Now there's only one word for V-Rally 3's visuals, and that is phenomenal. I had a really hard time believing that the game was going to look as good as it did in the magazines back in the day, but it looked even better in motion. Not only that, but it manages to keep a silky smooth 30 FPS constantly. Not only does this game feature fully texture mapped polygons, but the textures are incredibly detailed, colourful and varied as well. Another great addition are the various weather effects and time of day changes, which truly make the game much harder, as you'll find yourself relying on your co-pilot's directions and the map a lot more. When it comes to racing games on the Game Boy Advance, it doesn't get much better than this. There's a ton of impressive RPGs on the Game Boy Advance, but when it comes to sheer visual fidelity, the gold standard has to be Golden Sun. It's all you take in charge of Isaac, a young man who sets out to locate and retrieve several elemental stars that keep the game's little world at peace. When it comes to gameplay, it's your pretty standard RPG fare, and sees you visiting a variety of locales and acquiring a staggering amount of equipment and items. However, the real gameplay in any RPG is in its battle engine. So what extra element does Golden Sun add to the equation? This would be the ability to use summon spells called Djinn that characters can equip before fights. Much like armor, the Djinns come in elemental types, earth, water, wind and fire respectively, which affects how much damage they do depending on what element the enemy is related to itself. This adds a nice layer of strategy to the overall system that allows the player to experiment and utilize a wide range of options when it comes to taking on an enemy. But let's move on to one of the game's highest points, the visuals. Put simply, this game is stunning. The locations you'll find yourself coming across like towns and dungeons look great, extremely detailed, with lots of great little touches, such as animated water and fire, to steam coming from stoves and palm trees swaying in the wind. But it's within battle where everything is taken to the next level. Characters and environments take on a pseudo 3D presentation for each and every fight to play out in. Every attack, spell or summon is accompanied by some rather impressive particle effects that help each move come to life in a mesmerizing way. Seeing it running on the handheld is a real sight to behold and a testament to the talent of the team behind it. Like many other games in the series, Driver 3 also received a handheld version of its third outing on the Game Boy Advance. This time around, the game would take advantage of the same game engine that powered the likes of V-Rally 3 and Stuntman to some spectacular results. As in the original home console version, the player controls series protagonist Tanner, who infiltrates the South Beach Gang, a group of car thieves based in Miami. The story itself is mainly told through cutscenes that employ stills from the rendered scenes of the original game, with dialogue adapted to any changes in the story that were made. One notable difference is the lack of content, as while the original moved through 3 different cities, you're only going to get Miami and Nice. This is kind of understandable considering the limitations of the hardware, and with only 2 cities, it's still a blast to play through. The gameplay is largely split up into a series of missions that range from chasing cars to getting to a certain location within a time limit, or protecting another character, much more. But of course, the most impressive aspect of the game is no doubt its presentation. It's all rather crude by today's standards, but the amount of work that clearly went into making Driver 3 on the GBA what it is cannot be understated. Each car, NPC, building, as well as Tanner himself, presented in great detail. On top of this, a believable sense of speed is achieved when it comes to driving, which really helps pull you into the experience. Overall, Driver 3 has got to be commended for what it achieved with such limited power. Well, that does it for today's video. Keep an eye out for part 2, as that will be coming up soon, so don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified about new videos, which release every Tuesday and Friday. You can follow me on all of the socials to stay up to date, and also join the growing community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with. I'd like to give a special shout out to our Patreon supporters Rhino, Skill Jim, Nano, Steve, Richard, Amy, Paul, Dio, Alex, Pierre, Carl, Strider, Omar and Paddy J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. If you're interested in joining my Discord or supporting my channel through Patreon, you'll find all of these links in the description. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. I'll catch you next time.